Chapter 1. The Grand Opening. The air outside La Belle Époque shimmered with excitement, the soft glow of gas lamps illuminating the elegant facade of London's newest dining establishment. The restaurant's opening had been the talk of the season, promising an unparalleled experience of French cuisine in the heart of the city. Tonight, the dining room was filled with the hum of laughter, the clink of crystal glasses, and the rustle of fine evening wear. Inspector Price adjusted his cravat as he stepped out of the hansom cab, surveying the scene. He wasn't accustomed to such grand events, but had reluctantly accepted the invitation extended by his old friend, Sir Geoffrey Blake. "You must come, Price," Sir Geoffrey had insisted. "A night away from murder cases and grimy streets will do you good. Besides, it's bound to be a fascinating crowd." Price sighed inwardly as he handed his coat to the doorman and stepped inside. The restaurant's interior was a symphony of opulence: gleaming mahogany, gilded mirrors, and chandeliers dripping with crystals. Waiters glided through the room, balancing silver trays laden with hors d'oeuvres. At the center of it all was Sir Geoffrey himself, the consummate politician, laughing heartily as he held court among a circle of admirers. "Price!" Sir Geoffrey's booming voice cut through the din as he spotted the inspector. "You made it!" "Good evening, Sir Geoffrey," Price replied, shaking his friend's hand. "Quite the gathering you've assembled." "Only the best for La Belle Époque," Sir Geoffrey said, gesturing expansively. "Meet Monsieur Henri Bouchard, the genius behind it all." A man with a thin moustache and sharp eyes stepped forward, his chef's whites pristine. "Inspector Price," he said with a faint French accent, "it is an honor to welcome you. I hope our offerings tonight will delight your palate." "I'm sure they will," Price replied politely, though his culinary knowledge extended little beyond meat pies and roast beef. As the evening unfolded, Price found himself observing the room with the practiced eye of a detective. Politicians, artists, and industrialists mingled, their conversations weaving a tapestry of ambition and intrigue. He noted a few familiar faces, including Lord Albright, a fellow member of Parliament and Sir Geoffrey's occasional rival, seated at a nearby table. Lord Albright's stern expression suggested he was less impressed by the evening's festivities. The dinner service began with an array of dishes so exquisitely presented that even Price felt a flicker of admiration. The guests murmured their approval as each course was unveiled, from delicate consommé to succulent quail. Sir Geoffrey, ever the showman, made a point of toasting each dish, his glass of wine never empty for long. But as the main course arrived, a tender filet mignon served with a rich red wine reduction, an undercurrent of tension rippled through the room. Sir Geoffrey had barely taken his first bite when his jovial demeanor faltered. He clutched his throat, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "Geoffrey!" Lady Eleanor, his wife, cried out, rising from her seat. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Sir Geoffrey, who now gasped for air. A waiter rushed forward, but before anyone could react further, Sir Geoffrey collapsed, his body striking the table with a sickening thud. Pandemonium erupted. Lady Eleanor screamed, while guests scrambled to their feet. "Fetch a doctor," someone shouted, though it was clear to Price, even from a distance, that it was too late. He pushed through the throng of onlookers, kneeling beside his friend's lifeless form. The signs were unmistakable: dilated pupils, bluish lips, and a faint, acrid smell clinging to Sir Geoffrey's plate. Poison. Price's mind shifted into professional mode as he rose, his gaze sweeping the room. "No one is to leave," he announced firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is now a matter for Scotland Yard." Monsieur Bouchard appeared at his side, his face pale. "Inspector, surely this is a terrible accident." "An accident," Price said, his tone sharp. "Poison does not find its way onto a plate by accident, Monsieur Bouchard." He turned to the assembled guests, their faces a mix of shock and indignation. Somewhere among them, Price knew, was the person responsible for Sir Geoffrey's death. Chapter 2, A Poison Plate. The aftermath of Sir Geoffrey Blake's collapse turned the once celebratory atmosphere of La Belle Époque into a tableau of chaos and suspicion. Waiters scurried to and fro, some attempting to calm the distraught guests, while others hovered uncertainly by the door. The glittering chandeliers above cast a cold light over the grim scene as Inspector Price stood beside the lifeless body of his friend. "Clear the room," Price commanded, his voice firm but measured, except for the immediate staff and those seated near Sir Geoffrey. A ripple of murmurs ran through the guests, but none dared defy the inspector's order. Slowly the crowd dispersed into the adjacent lounge, leaving behind a small cluster of individuals. Lady Eleanor Blake sat trembling in her chair, her face ashen. To her left was Lord Albright, his sharp features set in a mask of indignant outrage. Nearby stood Monsieur Henri Bouchard, the restaurant's celebrated chef, wringing his hands as he muttered to himself in French. The waiter who had served Sir Geoffrey's table lingered at a distance, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Monsieur Bouchard," Price said, addressing the chef, "I need to know everything about tonight's menu. Were there any unusual ingredients or substitutions?" Bouchard's hands flew to his chest in a gesture of protest. "Inspector, I assure you every dish was prepared with the utmost care. The filet mignon was seasoned simply, as it should be, with only the finest herbs and a touch of red wine." Price's gaze narrowed. "Who handled the plate before it reached Sir Geoffrey?" The chef hesitated, his eyes darting toward the waiter. "Jacques served the table. He is one of my most trusted staff." "Is that so?" Price said, turning to the young man. Jacques was pale, his hands trembling as he twisted a napkin in his fingers. "Oui, monsieur," Jacques stammered. "I brought the plate directly from the kitchen to the table. I swear, I did nothing wrong." Price's keen eyes assayed the waiter's demeanor. "And you noticed nothing unusual? No one tampered with the dish on its way to Sir Geoffrey?" Jacques shook his head vehemently. "Non, monsieur. It was a busy night, but I was careful. I saw nothing." "Inspector," Lord Albright interjected, his tone dripping with disdain, "are you seriously suggesting that one of us poisoned Sir Geoffrey? It's unthinkable." "Unthinkable, perhaps," Price replied evenly, "but not impossible. You were seated directly across from him, were you not, Lord Albright?" The politician bristled. "Are you accusing me? Sir Geoffrey and I may have had our disagreements, but I would never stoop to such treachery." Price held his gaze for a moment before turning to Lady Eleanor. "My condolences, Lady Eleanor. I know this is a difficult time, but I must ask, did Sir Geoffrey mention anything unusual in the days leading up to tonight? Any threats or concerns?" Lady Eleanor's lips trembled as she spoke. He was always under pressure. His work in Parliament made him many enemies, but he never mentioned anything specific. He was... Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Price nodded sympathetically before signaling to one of the waiters. "Bring me the plate and the wine glass Sir Geoffrey used. Do not touch the contents." The requested items were placed carefully on a side table. Price leaned in, examining the remains of the filet mignon and the deep red liquid in the glass. A faint, acrid odor confirmed his suspicions. "Arsenic," he murmured to himself. "Arsenic!" Bouchard exclaimed, his voice rising. "Impossible! How could such a thing find its way into my kitchen?" "That," Price said, straightening, "is what we're going to find out. Until then, this restaurant is a crime scene. No one is to leave the premises without my permission." Price turned to one of his constables, who had arrived shortly after the commotion. "Take statements from everyone present, including the staff. Pay special attention to anyone who may have had access to the kitchen or the dining room." As the constable began his task, Price took a moment to reflect. The poisoning of Sir Geoffrey was no random act. It was deliberate, calculated, and precise. The question was, who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to carry it out? The answer, Price knew, lay somewhere within the tangled web of relationships and rivalries that had converged in La Belle Époque that evening. Chapter 3. The usual suspects. Inspector Price began his investigation by interviewing the four most likely suspects, each of whom had been within close proximity to Sir Geoffrey Blake and had varying motives for wanting him silenced. The chef, Monsieur Henri Bouchard. Price's first stop was the kitchen, where Henri Bouchard was pacing back and forth, his white chef's coat now stained with perspiration. The usually confident chef appeared rattled, his hands fidgeting as Price approached. "Monsieur Bouchard," Price began, "you've already told me about tonight's menu. Now I need to know more about your interactions with Sir Geoffrey." Bouchard's eyes widened. "Interactions?" "I hardly spoke to the man, Inspector. He was a patron, nothing more." "Yet I've been informed there was a heated exchange between the two of you earlier this evening," Price countered. "What was that about?" The chef's face flushed. "It was a minor disagreement. Sir Geoffrey was dissatisfied with the wine pairing. He called it common." "And how did you respond?" Price asked, his tone neutral but probing. "I told him," Bouchard said, his voice rising defensively, "that he was free to choose another vintage if he wished. But he refused, and we exchanged words. I admit I lost my temper, but that is all." Price nodded slowly. "Did you notice anyone acting suspiciously in your kitchen tonight?" Bouchard hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Inspector. My staff are professionals. None of them would dare compromise my reputation." The owner, Charles Wentworth. Next, Price sought out Charles Wentworth, the owner of La Belle Époque. He found the man in his office, nervously shuffling papers. Wentworth was a portly man in his late 50s, with a receding hairline and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow. "Inspector," Wentworth said, his voice trembling slightly, "this is a disaster. Do you have any idea what this will do to my business?" "I'm more concerned about Sir Geoffrey's death than your profits," Price replied sharply. "Now tell me, what was your relationship with Sir Geoffrey?" Wentworth's eyes darted nervously. "We were acquaintances. He was a frequent patron, and he—" "He what?" Price pressed. Wentworth sighed. "He blocked a licensing deal I was pursuing. It would have expanded my restaurant empire, but he deemed it imprudent. I was furious, of course, but I would never harm him." The fellow politician, Lord Albright. Price's next interview was with Lord Albright, who had relocated to the lounge but was still visibly agitated. He sat stiffly in an armchair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "Lord Albright," Price began, "you were seated directly across from Sir Geoffrey tonight. What can you tell me about your interactions?" Albright snorted. "Interactions?" The man was insufferable, always so self-righteous, so convinced of his moral superiority. "We had a disagreement about trade policy earlier this evening, but it was hardly unusual." "And what was the nature of this disagreement?" Price asked. "He accused me of pandering to special interests," Albright said with a sneer. "As if he's never done the same. Hypocrite." The waiter, Jacques. Finally, Price returned to Jacques, the young waiter who had served Sir Geoffrey's table. The man was seated in the kitchen, his head in his hands. "Jacques," Price said, his tone gentler than before, "tell me about your past. Where were you before you worked here?" Jacques looked up, his eyes wide with fear. I worked in Marseille, Inspector, at a small café. I came to London for a better life." "And have you had any trouble with the law?" Price asked. Jacques hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I was accused of theft once, but I was innocent. It was a misunderstanding." Price studied the waiter's face. "Did anyone approach you tonight, offer you money, or make threats?" Jacques shook his head vehemently. "No, Inspector. I swear, I know nothing about what happened to Sir Geoffrey." Each suspect had motive and opportunity, but none presented a clear path to the truth. As the inspector prepared to delve deeper into the investigation, he knew the next step would take him back to the scene of the crime. The kitchen, where the poisoned plate had originated. Chapter 4. Clues in the Kitchen. Inspector Price returned to the kitchen, now emptied of its bustling staff. The room felt eerily quiet, its gleaming surfaces reflecting the dim overhead lights. Price moved methodically, examining every corner with the scrutiny of a seasoned investigator. The answers he sought were here, hidden among the tools of the trade. The counter where Sir Geoffrey's meal had been prepared was his first focus. It was impeccably clean, save for a faint powdery residue near the edge. Price leaned closer, carefully collecting a sample in a glass vial. The smell was faintly acrid, confirming his suspicion that it was some kind of toxin. Next, Price's attention was drawn to the spice rack, an array of jars neatly labelled in Bouchard's meticulous hand. He examined each jar, noting nothing amiss until he reached a container of dried basil. The lid was loose, and inside he found tiny white granules that didn't belong. He pocketed a small amount for testing. As he moved to the stove, a glint of metal on the floor caught his eye. Crouching, he retrieved a small glass vial with a scratched-off label. Inside was a minute amount of a clear liquid. Price's pulse quickened. This could be the missing link. Further inspection revealed a torn slip of paper lodged behind a cutting board. The note, written in hurried, almost illegible script, read, "Ensure tonight's service is perfect. No mistakes." The message was ambiguous but hinted at mounting pressure on the kitchen staff. He moved to the storage area, a small cramped room filled with sacks of flour and crates of vegetables. Tucked behind a stack of wine bottles, he found another clue, a leather-bound notebook. Flipping through its pages, he discovered detailed records of ingredient orders, some of which seemed out of place. Arsenic compounds were listed among the supplies, disguised under the name of a rare seasoning. Price's investigation was interrupted by a constable entering the kitchen. "Inspector, we found this in the staff lockers," the young officer said, handing over a satchel. Inside were several vials, each labelled with chemical symbols. One was unmistakably marked as arsenic. "Bag everything," Price ordered, "and make sure it's analysed immediately." Returning to his notes, Price reviewed the evidence. The granules in the basil jar, the suspicious vial, the notebook, and now the satchel all painted a picture of premeditation. But was this the work of one individual, or a conspiracy? Price's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the kitchen door. A breathless waiter entered. "Inspector, you need to see this," he said, holding a silver tray. On it lay another note, hastily scrawled and left in the dining room. "The truth is closer than you think." Price's mind raced. The killer was toying with him, but they had made one critical mistake, underestimating his resolve. The clues were coming together, and soon so would the identity of the murderer. Chapter 5. Shadows of Deception. Inspector Price retired to his makeshift office, a quiet corner of the restaurant where he could lay out the evidence collected thus far. The satchel with the vials, the torn note, the suspicious notebook, and the powdered residue from the basil jar were all laid out before him. These were not isolated pieces. They were threads of a larger tapestry of deceit and murder. Yet the question remained, who had woven them together?
As Price reviewed his notes, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Constable Harris, his trusted aide. "Inspector, the lab has already provided preliminary findings on the basil and the residue from the plate." "And?" Price asked, gesturing for Harris to continue. "Arsenic, sir. Both samples contain traces of arsenic. The concentration suggests it was deliberately mixed into the seasoning." Price nodded, unsurprised but now even more resolute. "And the vials from the satchel?" Harris hesitated. "Still being analysed, but one of the vials appears to match the contents of the residue. The others, they're more obscure compounds. Could be poisons as well." Price leaned back in his chair. "It's beginning to come together. Someone in this restaurant, whether staff or guest, had the means and opportunity to mix arsenic into Sir Geoffrey's food. But why the note? Why play these games?" Harris frowned. "Perhaps they wanted to throw you off the scent, sir. Or perhaps..." They wanted you to know they're smarter. The inspector mulled over the idea. It wasn't uncommon for a killer with a sense of superiority to toy with their pursuers, but such arrogance often led to mistakes. Price decided to revisit the suspects, armed with his new information. First he called in Jacques, the waiter. Jacques' nervous energy had not subsided, and he fidgeted under the inspector's gaze. "Jacques," Price began, "tell me about the satchel found in the lockers. Do you recognize it?" Jacques' eyes widened. "Non, monsieur. I've never seen it before." "And yet it was found in a locker near your station," Price pressed. "Are you sure you've never handled anything like it?" Jacques shook his head vehemently. "I swear, Inspector, I've done nothing wrong. Please, you must believe me." Next, Price turned to Lord Albright. The politician was seated in the lounge, his stern demeanour unchanged. "Lord Albright, you were seated across from Sir Geoffrey during the meal. Did you notice anything unusual about his behaviour or the food?" "No more than usual," Albright replied curtly. "The man was always pompous, and his tastes were ostentatious. But I'd hardly call that unusual." "And what of your argument earlier?" Price asked. "Could it have provoked him to act out?" Albright bristled. "Our disagreements were professional, not personal. Whatever vendetta you think I might have had, Inspector, I assure you I'm innocent." Finally, Price returned to Harding and Bouchard. The two men were now sitting together, their expressions grim. "Gentlemen," Price began, "I've uncovered evidence of arsenic in Sir Geoffrey's meal. It's clear that someone with access to this kitchen tampered with his food." Harding's face paled. "Surely you don't think I had no reason to harm Sir Geoffrey." "No reason," Price said sharply. "What about his demands for changes to the restaurant? His interference with your plans?" Harding stammered but said nothing. Bouchard interjected, his voice steady. "Inspector, I run a disciplined kitchen. If someone tampered with the food, they did so without my knowledge." "And the basil," Price countered. "The jar in your spice rack contained arsenic." Bouchard's composure faltered. "That's impossible. I personally oversee every ingredient that enters my kitchen." Price studied the two men. Both had motive, and both had opportunity. But something didn't add up. The killer had left too many breadcrumbs, too many clues pointing to the kitchen. It felt orchestrated, deliberate. As Price prepared to leave, another note was delivered to him, this time slipped under the lounge door. "Not everything is as it seems," it read. "The truth hides in plain sight." Price's determination hardened. The killer was close, perhaps even watching his every move. But they had made one crucial error, underestimating his ability to see through the shadows of deception. The hunt was far from over.
Chapter 6. The Breakthrough. The sun rose reluctantly over London, casting pale, hesitant light through the windows of La Belle Époque. Inspector Price sat in a corner of the dining room, his coffee untouched as he sifted through the mounting evidence. A murder so meticulously executed left little room for error, yet Price was certain the killer had made a mistake. His task was to find it. Constable Harris entered, a thick file in hand. "Inspector," he said, placing it on the table. "The lab results are in." Price opened the file, his sharp eyes scanning the pages. The chemical analysis of the vial found in the kitchen confirmed it contained arsenic, identical to the traces found in Sir Geoffrey's meal. Another document detailed the handwriting analysis of the notebook, revealing inconsistencies with Chef Bouchard's neat script. Someone else had added the entry for exotic seasoning. "Harris," Price said, tapping the page, "find out who in the kitchen staff has access to inventory records. We're narrowing this down." Harris nodded. "And the note found in the dining room?" "A red herring," Price mused, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "It's taunting us, but it might also reveal the killer's arrogance. Whoever wrote it wants us to see them as clever, above suspicion." Price closed the file and stood, the weight of the investigation propelling him forward. It was time to revisit the suspects, this time with the evidence he had collected thus far. Charles Harding, the desperate owner. Charles Harding sat in the office of La Belle Époque, his hands trembling as he clutched a handkerchief. Price entered, his presence commanding the small room. "Mr. Harding," Price began, "you've claimed that you had no reason to harm Sir Geoffrey, but your financial records suggest otherwise. His refusal to support your licensing deal was a significant blow to your plans." Harding's face turned ashen. "Inspector, I was angry, yes, but I'm not a killer. My reputation, my livelihood, it's all tied to this place." "Precisely," Price said coolly. "Your desperation to keep this establishment afloat could have driven you to take drastic measures. A sudden tragedy like this might even draw sympathy and new patrons." "That's absurd," Harding protested. "I'd never jeopardize everything I've worked for." Price leaned closer. "Perhaps not directly, but tell me, Mr. Harding, how well do you know your staff? Would someone act on your behalf without your knowledge?" Harding's eyes darted nervously. I trust my staff implicitly." "We'll see," Price said, rising. "For your sake, I hope your trust is not misplaced." Henri Bouchard, the temperamental chef. Monsieur Bouchard was in his kitchen, meticulously inspecting a tray of freshly prepared pastries. When Price entered, the chef's expression soured. "Inspector," Bouchard said tersely, "you've disrupted my kitchen long enough." "Then you'll want to clear your name quickly," Price replied. "Arsenic was found in your basil jar, monsieur. Care to explain how it got there?" Bouchard's face twisted in disbelief. "Impossible. I oversee every ingredient that comes into my kitchen. Someone must have planted it." "Convenient," Price said. "And yet, the notebook with the ingredient order shows a suspicious entry in your inventory records. Not your handwriting, though. Who else has access to those records?" Bouchard hesitated. "Only my sous chef, Émile. He handles the paperwork when I'm busy." "Émile," Price said. "Where can I find him?" Bouchard gestured toward the back of the kitchen. "He's preparing the lunch service." Price made a note. "One last thing, monsieur. You argued with Sir Geoffrey earlier that evening. What exactly was said?" Bouchard's eyes flared. "He insulted my wine pairing, called it pedestrian. I told him he lacked taste. But arguments like that, they mean nothing." "Perhaps to you," Price said, "but to a man like Sir Geoffrey, words can carry weight." Émile, the sous chef. Émile was a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow. He stood nervously as Price questioned him in the pantry. "Émile," Price began, "you handle the inventory records, correct?" "Oui, Inspector," Émile said, "but only under Monsieur Bouchard's direction." "This entry," Price said, showing him the notebook, "for exotic seasoning. Is this your handwriting?" Émile squinted at the page, his face falling. "It looks like mine, but I did not write this. I swear, Inspector." "Who else has access to the notebook?" Price pressed. "Sometimes Jacques retrieves it for me," Émile admitted. "But he wouldn't know what to write." "Wouldn't he?" Price said. "Thank you, Émile. That will be all for now." Jacques, the nervous waiter. Price found Jacques pacing in the staff quarters, his usual nervous energy amplified. "Jacques," Price said, "you've been very forthcoming, but I have more questions. Why were you handling the inventory notebook?" Jacques froze. I sometimes help Émile. Only small things, Inspector. I didn't mean any harm." "And the satchel found in the lockers?" Price asked. "You claim not to recognize it, yet it was near your station." "I swear I've never seen it before," Jacques insisted. "Someone must have put it there to frame me." Price studied the young man. "Jacques, if you're withholding anything, now is the time to speak. The truth always finds its way out." Jacques' shoulders slumped. I saw Émile with the satchel once. He said it was spices for a special dish. I didn't think anything of it." As the day wore on, Inspector Price pieced together the narrative. Émile's access to the records and proximity to the arsenic jar placed him at the center of suspicion. Jacques' revelations added further weight to the theory, but Price wasn't ready to conclude. The final step would be a carefully orchestrated confrontation, designed to unmask the true culprit. Chapter 7. The Final Reveal. The evening descended over La Belle Époque, its once glittering facade now shadowed by the weight of murder and suspicion. Inside, the air was thick with tension as Inspector Price prepared for the culmination of his investigation. He had summoned all the suspects, Charles Harding, Henri Bouchard, Émile, Lord Albright, and Jacques, to the main dining room. Each sat at a separate table, their faces a blend of anxiety and defiance. Price stood at the head of the room, his calm yet commanding demeanor silencing the faint murmurs among the gathered. On the table before him were the pieces of evidence, the satchel of vials, the torn note, the leather-bound inventory book, and the vial of arsenic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Price began, his voice steady, "it has been a long and trying investigation. Sir Geoffrey Blake's murder was not an act of impulse, but one of careful calculation. Tonight, I will reveal the identity of his killer." Price gestured to the satchel. This satchel, found in the staff lockers, contained vials of various toxins, including arsenic. The vial matches the substance found in Sir Geoffrey's meal. He moved to the notebook. This inventory book contains an entry for exotic seasoning, which was later found to be arsenic disguised under a false name. The handwriting does not belong to Monsieur Bouchard, but to someone else with access to the records. He then picked up the torn note. This message, "Ensure tonight's service is perfect, no mistakes," was found in the kitchen. It reveals the mounting pressure on someone to carry out a sinister plan. Finally, Price held up the vial. And this vial of arsenic, found near the preparation area, ties everything together. Someone deliberately introduced it into Sir Geoffrey's meal. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. But evidence alone is not enough. Motive, opportunity, and deception are the true keys to solving this case. Price turned first to Charles Harding. "Mr. Harding, your financial troubles and Sir Geoffrey's refusal to support your licensing deal gave you a motive. Yet you lack the means to execute such a precise plan. You may be desperate, but desperation alone does not make you a murderer." Harding exhaled deeply, relief washing over his face. Next, Inspector Price addressed Henri Bouchard. "Monsieur Bouchard, your argument with Sir Geoffrey over the wine pairing showed your temper, and the arsenic was found in your spice rack. But your meticulous nature and devotion to your craft suggest you would never allow such contamination in your kitchen. You are guilty of pride, but not of murder." Bouchard's expression softened, though his hands remained tense on the table. Price then faced Lord Albright. "Lord Albright, your political rivalry with Sir Geoffrey and your heated argument that evening gave you a clear motive. However, you were seated at the table with him and had no access to the kitchen or the means to poison his meal. Your sharp words may wound, but they do not kill." Albright's lips tightened, but he nodded curtly. Turning to Jacques, Price's voice grew firmer. "Jacques, you handled the meal and had access to the kitchen. Your nervousness and evasive answers suggest you know more than you have admitted. However, your actions point to fear, not guilt. You were manipulated by someone else." Jacques' eyes widened. "I swear, Inspector, I didn't know. I only did what I was told." Price's gaze settled on Émile, the sous-chef. "And now we come to you, Émile. You had access to the inventory records, the kitchen, and the spice rack. Your handwriting matches the suspicious entry for arsenic in the notebook. Jacques has also placed the satchel in your possession. You had the means, the opportunity, and a motive." Émile's face paled, but he remained silent. The inspector continued, his voice unyielding. "Your motive, Émile, was revenge. Sir Geoffrey's policies as a politician directly impacted your family in France, driving them into financial ruin. You came to London seeking a new life, but harbored a deep grudge against the man who caused your suffering." Émile's composure cracked. "You don't understand," he spat. "Men like Sir Geoffrey think they can do whatever they please, ruin lives, and walk away unscathed, he deserved to pay for what he did. Perhaps, Price said calmly, but justice is not yours to dispense. By taking his life, you not only committed murder, but also endangered the innocent people who trusted you. As Emile was taken away by the constables, the remaining suspects sat in stunned silence. Price addressed them one final time. This tragedy reminds us that even the most calculated plans leave traces. Sir Geoffrey's death was a result of anger and vengeance, but justice has prevailed. As the dining room emptied, Price lingered for a moment, his gaze falling on the evidence before him. The case was closed, but the weight of its revelations lingered. In the world of power and politics, the lines between right and wrong often blurred. Yet Price knew his duty, to seek the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Outside, the London streets buzzed with life, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded within the walls of La Belle Époque. Inspector Price returned to his office at the Scotland Yard, ready to solve his next case.